Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had always known that being one of the first female Navy SEALs would come with extra challenges. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as she checked her gear one final time. Her team of 8 elite soldiers was preparing for what intelligence called a routine reconnaissance mission in the Helmand province. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she secured her rifle and adjusted her tactical vest. The weight of leadership pressed on her shoulders more heavily than her equipment. At 28, she had proven herself countless times, but she still felt the eyes of her male teammates watching her every move, waiting for any sign of weakness. The briefing had been straightforward. Their target was a suspected Taliban compound nestled in a valley 3 miles from their current position. Local informants reported unusual activity in the area, and command wanted eyes on the situation. Sarah's team would move in under cover of darkness, establish surveillance, and report back within 72 hours. As the team leader, Sarah studied the terrain maps one more time. The route would take them through rocky paths and narrow canyon passages. It was perfect terrain for an ambush, but intelligence assured them the area was clear of enemy forces. Something in her gut told her otherwise, but she pushed the feeling aside. Years of training had taught her to trust the mission briefing while staying alert to changing circumstances. Her second-in-command, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, approached with a concerned expression. He had been her closest friend since SEAL training, and she could read the worry in his eyes. They had worked together on dozens of missions, and their teamwork was legendary within their unit. The team gathered for final equipment checks as the sun began to set behind the jagged mountain peaks. Each soldier carried enough supplies for 3 days in hostile territory. Sarah's backpack contained not just survival gear, but also the advanced surveillance equipment they would need to complete their mission. As they prepared to move out, Sarah noticed unusual radio chatter from nearby units. Reports of increased enemy movement in adjacent sectors filtered through their communication system. The intelligence picture was changing rapidly, but their orders remained unchanged. Command expected them to proceed as planned. The first few hours of their movement went smoothly. The team moved like ghosts through the mountain terrain, using night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous paths. Sarah led from the front, setting a steady pace that would get them to their destination before dawn. But as they approached a narrow canyon that would lead them to their surveillance position, Sarah's instincts screamed danger. The silence was too perfect, and the natural sounds of the mountain wildlife had disappeared completely. She raised her hand to signal the team to halt, but it was already too late. The first explosion shattered the night air, sending rocks and debris cascading down the canyon walls. Sarah's world erupted into chaos as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from multiple positions above them. Her team was trapped in a kill zone, surrounded by enemy fighters who had been waiting for them. Sarah's training kicked in immediately as she dove for cover behind a large boulder. She could hear her teammates shouting orders and returning fire, but the enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly. Every possible escape route was covered by machine gun positions, and the SEALs were pinned down with nowhere to run. The intensity of the gunfire was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. Bullets ricocheted off the rocky walls around them, creating a deadly storm of lead and stone fragments. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 20 different positions, meaning they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Sarah tried to reach her radio to call for backup, but enemy fire forced her to keep her head down. She could hear Rodriguez somewhere to her left, coordinating their defensive positions, but the sound of his voice was nearly drowned out by the constant gunfire and explosions. As the minutes stretched on, Sarah realized this was no random encounter. The enemy had known exactly where they would be and when they would arrive. Someone had leaked their mission details, and her team had walked straight into a carefully planned trap. The thought filled her with cold rage, but she channeled that anger into determination to keep her soldiers alive. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah managed to take out 2 enemy positions with precise rifle fire, but for every fighter they eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. The enemy had prepared for this ambush with military precision, and Sarah's team was running out of ammunition fast. In a brief lull in the gunfire, Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. She screamed a warning to her team just as the first shell exploded nearby, sending a massive shockwave through the canyon. The enemy was bringing heavy weapons to bear, and Sarah knew her team had only minutes before their position became completely untenable. As she prepared to order a desperate breakout attempt, Sarah caught sight of movement on the canyon rim above them. More enemy fighters were moving into position, and she realized with growing horror that they were about to be completely surrounded. The mission had become a fight for survival, and the odds were getting worse by the minute. The mortar rounds fell like deadly rain around Sarah's position. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the rocky canyon, loosening boulders that crashed down around the trapped SEAL team. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall as shrapnel whistled overhead, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see her teammates scattered among the rocks, each one fighting their own desperate battle for survival. Corpsman Johnson was treating a wounded soldier behind a cluster of boulders, while enemy bullets sparked off the rocks around them. The metallic taste of fear and gunpowder filled Sarah's mouth as she tried to assess their situation. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her radio, barely audible over the gunfire. 3 team members were wounded, ammunition was running critically low, and the enemy was moving to surround their position completely. Sarah realized they had perhaps 10 minutes before the trap closed entirely. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, offering no easy escape route. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly, controlling the high ground while forcing the SEALs into an impossible tactical situation. Sarah's mind raced through their limited options, each one more dangerous than the last. She spotted a narrow ledge about 30 feet up the eastern canyon wall. It would be a difficult climb under the best circumstances, but with enemy fire raining down on them, it would be nearly suicidal. Still, it might be their only chance to break out of the kill zone and reach higher ground where they could fight back effectively. Sarah keyed her radio and began issuing rapid orders to her team. They would attempt a fighting withdrawal to the base of the eastern wall, then climb in pairs while the others provided covering fire. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but staying in their current position meant certain death. The team began moving immediately, using every piece of cover available as they bounded from rock to rock. Sarah provided covering fire as Rodriguez and 2 other SEALs sprinted toward the canyon wall. Enemy bullets followed their movement, kicking up dust and stone chips around their feet. As Rodriguez reached the base of the wall and began climbing, Sarah noticed enemy fighters moving along the canyon rim above them. The fighters were carrying what looked like rocket-propelled grenades, and she knew that once those weapons came into play, her team would have no chance at all. Sarah made a split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She stepped out from behind her cover and opened fire on the enemy positions above, drawing their attention away from her climbing teammates. Her accurate rifle fire forced several enemies to take cover, buying precious seconds for Rodriguez and the others. But her bold move had consequences. Multiple enemy fighters immediately focused their fire on her position, forcing her to dive behind a small boulder that provided inadequate protection. Bullets chipped away at the rock around her as she tried to reload her rifle with shaking hands. The sound of a rocket-propelled grenade launch reached her ears just as Rodriguez shouted a warning from above. Sarah looked up to see the deadly projectile streaking directly toward her position. Time seemed to slow as she realized there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The explosion lifted Sarah off her feet and threw her backward against the canyon wall. The impact drove the air from her lungs and filled her vision with bright flashes of light and color. She felt herself falling, her rifle spinning away into the darkness as rocks and debris rained down around her. When Sarah hit the ground, the world went silent for a moment. Her ears were ringing and she could taste blood in her mouth. Through the haze of pain and confusion, she could see her teammates still fighting above her, their muzzle flashes creating brief moments of light in the darkness. She tried to move but discovered that her left arm wouldn't respond properly. Looking down, she saw that her tactical vest was torn and bloody, and she could feel warm liquid spreading across her chest. The realization that she was badly wounded sent a chill of fear through her body. Sarah attempted to reach for her sidearm but found that her right shoulder was also injured. Every movement sent waves of agony through her body, and she could feel her strength ebbing away with each passing second. The sounds of battle above her seemed to be growing more distant and muffled. Through her fading consciousness, she heard Rodriguez screaming her name over the radio. His voice was filled with panic and desperation, but Sarah couldn't find the strength to respond. Her vision was beginning to blur and darkness was creeping in from the edges of her sight. The last thing Sarah remembered was the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Rescue was coming, but she wasn't sure if it would arrive in time. As consciousness slipped away from her, she thought about her family back home and wondered if she would ever see them again. The battle continued to rage above her motionless form. Rodriguez and the remaining team members had managed to reach a defensible position on the canyon rim, but they were still heavily outnumbered and low on ammunition. The arrival of the rescue helicopters turned the tide of the battle, but it came at a terrible cost. When the dust finally settled and the enemy fighters had been driven off, Rodriguez climbed down to search for Sarah's body. He found her lying motionless among the rocks at the base of the canyon wall, her uniform torn and bloodied. There was no pulse, no sign of breathing, and her skin was already growing cold. The medics who arrived with the rescue team confirmed what Rodriguez already knew in his heart. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, one of the first female Navy SEALs, had died in the line of duty, sacrificing herself to save her teammates. Her body was carefully prepared for transport back to the base, where she would begin the long journey home. The military hospital at Bagram Air Base operated around the clock, processing casualties from across Afghanistan. Sarah's body arrived in the early morning hours, accompanied by Rodriguez, who had refused to leave his team leader's side. The initial medical examination confirmed what everyone already believed. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had been killed in action. Dr. Captain James Mitchell had seen hundreds of casualties during his deployment, but something about this case troubled him deeply. The young female SEAL showed all the obvious signs of death. No pulse, no breathing, no response to stimulation. Yet something nagged at the back of his medical training, a small voice telling him to look closer. Rodriguez paced the hallway outside the medical facility, his uniform still stained with dirt and blood from the firefight. Other members of Sarah's surviving team sat nearby, their faces showing the haunted expression of soldiers who had watched their leader fall. The official notification process had already begun, and Sarah's family back in Texas would soon receive the devastating news. Inside the examination room, Dr. Mitchell began the routine procedures for processing a fallen soldier. Sarah's body lay on the metal table, her tactical gear removed to reveal the extent of her injuries. Multiple shrapnel wounds marked her chest and arms, and there was evidence of severe blunt force trauma from the explosion that had thrown her against the canyon wall. But as Dr. Mitchell worked, he noticed something unusual. Despite the obvious trauma, Sarah's body temperature hadn't dropped as much as he would expect for someone who had been dead for several hours. Her skin still retained a slight warmth that puzzled the experienced military physician. Curiosity drove him to check for vital signs one more time, using more sensitive equipment than the battlefield medics had available. The heart monitor remained flat, showing no electrical activity. The pulse oximeter detected no blood flow. Every medical instrument confirmed what his eyes could see. This soldier was clinically dead. Yet Dr. Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Years of medical training and battlefield experience had taught him to trust his instincts, especially when dealing with severe trauma cases. He decided to run a more comprehensive examination, even though it seemed pointless. As he prepared to draw blood samples for toxicology testing, Dr. Mitchell noticed the smallest possible movement in Sarah's chest. It was so slight that he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He stopped what he was doing and watched carefully for several minutes, but saw nothing more. Rodriguez entered the room as the doctor was completing his examination. The sergeant's face was etched with grief and guilt, blaming himself for his team leader's death. He approached Sarah's still form and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering words of goodbye that only he could hear. Dr. Mitchell was about to cover Sarah's body and complete the death certification when he noticed something that made him freeze. The temperature probe he had left attached to her body showed a reading that was impossible. Sarah's core body temperature was slowly rising instead of continuing to fall. He immediately called for his medical team, ordering them to prepare for emergency resuscitation procedures. Rodriguez stepped back in confusion as medical personnel flooded the room, pushing equipment and medications toward Sarah's table. The sergeant couldn't understand what was happening or why they were treating a dead soldier. Dr. Mitchell began working frantically, checking and rechecking his instruments. According to every medical test available, Sarah Martinez was dead and had been dead for hours, but her body temperature continued to climb, and he was beginning to detect the faintest possible signs of cellular activity in her blood work. The medical team worked for nearly an hour, running every diagnostic test in their arsenal. Sarah's body showed no response to any stimulus, no brain activity, and no cardiovascular function. Yet the mysterious warming trend continued, defying every medical explanation that Dr. Mitchell could think of. Rodriguez watched from the corner of the room as the medical team debated what they were seeing. Part of him dared to hope that his team leader might somehow still be alive, while his logical mind told him that such a thing was impossible. He had seen Sarah take a direct hit from an RPG and watched her lifeless body for hours afterward. As the sun began to set outside the hospital windows, Dr. Mitchell made a decision that went against everything in his medical training. Despite all evidence to the contrary, he ordered Sarah's body to be moved to the intensive care unit instead of the morgue. He couldn't explain what he was seeing, but he wasn't ready to give up on the young SEAL officer. The ICU team was skeptical about treating a patient who showed no signs of life, but Dr. Mitchell's reputation carried weight. Sarah was connected to every monitoring device available, even though the machines continued to show flat lines across the board. Her body was warmed and maintained on life support, despite the apparent futility of the effort. Rodriguez refused to leave the hospital, maintaining a vigil beside Sarah's bed through the night. Other members of their SEAL team joined him, creating an around-the-clock presence in the ICU. Word of the unusual situation spread throughout the base, drawing curious medical personnel who wanted to witness the impossible case. As midnight approached, Sarah's body temperature finally stabilized within normal ranges. Dr. Mitchell had run out of medical explanations for what he was observing. Every textbook told him that what he was seeing was impossible, yet the evidence was right in front of him. The monitors continued to show no brain activity, no heart rhythm, and no breathing. Sarah Martinez was clinically dead by every measure known to medical science. Yet something was happening inside her body that defied explanation, something that kept Dr. Mitchell watching and hoping for a miracle that seemed impossible. Rodriguez held his team leader's hand as the clock struck 12, whispering a promise that her sacrifice would never be forgotten. He had no way of knowing that deep within Sarah's still form, changes were beginning to occur that would challenge everything the medical team thought they knew about life and death. 3 days had passed since Sarah Martinez had been declared dead on the battlefield. Dr. Mitchell had become obsessed with her case, spending every free moment studying her condition and searching medical literature for any similar cases. The young SEAL's body remained in the ICU, connected to machines that continued to show no signs of life. The hospital staff began to whisper about the doctor's strange behavior. Some thought grief and exhaustion were affecting his judgment, while others wondered if the stress of treating so many casualties had finally broken him. Despite the criticism, Dr. Mitchell refused to give up on his impossible patient. Rodriguez and his teammates maintained their vigil, taking turns sitting beside Sarah's bed. The base chaplain had visited multiple times, offering comfort to the grieving soldiers, but Rodriguez insisted that something wasn't right about the whole situation. His gut instincts, honed by years of combat, told him that his team leader was still fighting somewhere deep inside her motionless body. On the morning of the 4th day, one of the ICU nurses noticed something that made her call Dr. Mitchell immediately. Sarah's fingernails, which had begun to show the blue discoloration typical of death, were slowly returning to a normal pink color. The change was so gradual that it might have been missed by someone not watching carefully. Dr. Mitchell rushed to examine his patient, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The color change in Sarah's nails suggested that blood circulation might be returning to her extremities, but every monitor still showed flat lines. Her heart wasn't beating, her lungs weren't breathing, yet somehow oxygenated blood was reaching her fingers and toes. He ordered immediate blood work and was amazed to discover that Sarah's blood chemistry was slowly normalizing. Toxin levels that had been dangerously high were beginning to drop, and cellular repair mechanisms appeared to be functioning despite the complete absence of cardiovascular activity. Nothing in his medical training could explain what he was seeing. The news of Sarah's mysterious condition began to spread beyond Bagram Air Base. Medical experts from around the world started contacting Dr. Mitchell, offering theories and requesting data about the unprecedented case. Some suggested that Sarah might be experiencing a form of suspended animation triggered by extreme trauma. Rodriguez noticed other subtle changes that the medical equipment couldn't detect. Sarah's skin temperature felt more normal to the touch, and the unnatural stillness that had marked her body was beginning to soften slightly. Her face, which had taken on the waxy appearance of death, was slowly regaining a more lifelike quality. On the 5th day, Dr. Mitchell made a startling discovery during his routine examination. When he lifted Sarah's eyelids to check her pupil response, he found that her eyes had moved slightly from their previous position. The change was minimal, but it was definitely there. Something was happening inside Sarah's brain. Even though the EEG machine showed no electrical activity, the medical team began running more sophisticated tests, using equipment that had been flown in from Germany specifically for Sarah's case. Advanced brain imaging revealed the most shocking discovery yet. There was definite neural activity occurring in parts of Sarah's brain, but it was happening at frequencies so low that conventional monitoring equipment couldn't detect it. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope when Dr. Mitchell shared this news with Sarah's team. For the first time since the ambush, he allowed himself to believe that his team leader might somehow survive her impossible ordeal. The other SEALs gathered around Sarah's bed, talking to her and sharing stories from their missions together, hoping their voices might somehow reach her. As the 6th day dawned, Sarah's body showed more signs of the mysterious recovery process. Her wounds were healing at an accelerated rate, and the severe bruising from the explosion was beginning to fade. Blood tests revealed that her immune system was functioning at levels far above normal, as if her body was working overtime to repair the damage. Dr. Mitchell had contacted medical researchers at Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic, sharing Sarah's data with the world's leading experts in trauma medicine and neurology. The consensus was that Sarah's condition was medically impossible, yet the evidence continued to mount that something extraordinary was happening inside her body. The ICU had become a focal point of attention throughout the base. High-ranking officers visited daily to check on Sarah's progress, and media personnel had begun asking questions about the female SEAL, who had apparently returned from the dead. Dr. Mitchell worked to keep the story contained, fearing that publicity might interfere with Sarah's recovery. Rodriguez spent hours talking to Sarah about their shared experiences in SEAL training, their successful missions together, and his plans for the future. He told her about the letters of condolence that had been pouring in from around the world, and how her sacrifice had inspired people far beyond the military community. Late on the 6th night, Rodriguez was alone with Sarah when he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Her chest had moved just slightly, as if she had taken the smallest possible breath. He watched intently for several minutes but saw nothing more. The ventilator continued to breathe for her, and the monitor showed no change in her condition. But Rodriguez knew what he had seen, and he immediately called for Dr. Mitchell. The doctor arrived within minutes and began a thorough examination, using every diagnostic tool at his disposal. The results were the same as always. No heartbeat, no brain activity, no spontaneous breathing. Yet both men agreed that something was different about Sarah's appearance. Her face seemed more peaceful, less like that of a person who had died and more like someone who was simply in a very deep sleep. The change was subtle but unmistakable to those who had been watching her closely for days. As the 7th day approached, Dr. Mitchell prepared for what he expected would be the most critical period in Sarah's mysterious journey. If the pattern he had been observing continued, something significant was going to happen very soon. He made sure that his best medical team was standing by, ready to respond to whatever miracle or tragedy might unfold in the hours ahead. The 7th day began like all the others, with Dr. Mitchell checking Sarah's vital signs and finding the same impossible results. Her body continued to show signs of healing and cellular activity, despite the complete absence of heartbeat or breathing. Rodriguez had spent another sleepless night beside her bed, refusing to give up hope even as exhaustion wore at his resolve. At exactly 08:47 hours, something changed. The heart monitor that had shown nothing but flat lines for a week suddenly registered a single weak beat. Dr. Mitchell, who was reviewing Sarah's latest blood work at the nurse's station, heard the distinctive beep and felt his pulse quicken with anticipation. He rushed to Sarah's bedside just as a second heartbeat appeared on the monitor, then a third. The beats were irregular and far apart, but they were definitely there. After days of medical impossibility, Sarah's heart was trying to restart itself. Rodriguez gripped her hand tighter, whispering urgent encouragement as more medical personnel flooded into the room. The next few hours were a blur of medical activity as Sarah's body began the slow process of returning to life. Her heart rhythm gradually stabilized, though it remained weak and required constant monitoring. Her blood pressure, which had been undetectable for days, slowly began to register on the sensitive equipment. Dr. Mitchell had seen many miraculous recoveries during his military career, but nothing had prepared him for watching someone literally come back from the dead. Sarah's brain activity remained minimal, showing only the faintest electrical patterns, but the fact that there was any activity at all defied every medical textbook he had ever studied. By late afternoon, Sarah's breathing began to show signs of spontaneous activity. The ventilator that had been breathing for her started to detect small efforts from her lungs to take in air on their own. Dr. Mitchell carefully adjusted the machine settings to allow Sarah's natural breathing reflexes to gradually take over the process. Rodriguez watched every change with growing hope and amazement. His team leader's skin was regaining its normal color, and the deathly stillness that had marked her body was giving way to subtle signs of life. Her chest rose and fell with increasing regularity as her breathing grew stronger throughout the day. News of Sarah's resurrection spread quickly through Bagram Air Base, creating a buzz of excitement and disbelief among the medical staff and military personnel. Soldiers who had heard about the female SEAL's impossible return from death began stopping by the ICU to witness the miracle for themselves. As evening approached, Sarah's vital signs continued to strengthen. Her heart rate had stabilized at 60 beats per minute, and her blood pressure had reached normal levels. The advanced brain monitoring equipment began to detect more complex patterns of neural activity, suggesting that higher brain functions might be returning. Dr. Mitchell remained cautiously optimistic, knowing that brain injuries could take days or weeks to fully manifest. Even if Sarah survived her miraculous ordeal, there was no guarantee that she would recover her mental faculties or physical abilities. The explosion that had killed her had caused massive trauma, and the week-long period without normal brain function could have lasting consequences. Rodriguez refused to leave Sarah's side as the critical hours passed. He talked to her continuously, sharing memories of their training together and updates about their surviving team members. Deep down, he believed that his voice might help guide her back to consciousness, even though the medical team couldn't yet detect any sign that she was aware of her surroundings. Late that night, one of the ICU nurses noticed that Sarah's eyes were moving beneath her closed lids. The rapid eye movement suggested that she might be experiencing dream sleep, a sign that her brain was beginning to process information normally again. Dr. Mitchell ordered additional neurological tests to monitor Sarah's progress toward consciousness. The 8th day brought even more encouraging developments. Sarah's breathing had become completely independent of the ventilator, and her heart rhythm had strengthened to nearly normal levels. Blood tests showed that her organ function was improving rapidly, with her kidneys and liver processing toxins at normal rates. Most importantly, brain scans revealed increasing electrical activity in the regions responsible for consciousness and memory. Dr. Mitchell began performing simple neurological tests, checking Sarah's reflexes and responses to various stimuli. While she remained unconscious, her body was beginning to react to touch and sound in ways that suggested her nervous system was healing. Rodriguez noticed that Sarah's hand seemed to squeeze his fingers slightly when he spoke to her about their successful missions together. The pressure was barely detectable, but it represented the first voluntary movement she had made since the explosion. He immediately called Dr. Mitchell, who confirmed that Sarah's grip strength was indeed responding to verbal stimulation. As word of Sarah's recovery spread beyond the base, media attention began to focus on the story of the female SEAL, who had seemingly returned from the dead. Military public affairs officers worked to control the narrative while protecting Sarah's privacy and the operational security of her unit. Dr. Mitchell found himself fielding calls from medical researchers around the world who wanted to study Sarah's case. The implications of her recovery could revolutionize understanding of brain death and trauma medicine. However, his primary concern remained Sarah's continued healing and eventual return to consciousness. The medical team began reducing Sarah's sedation levels, hoping that her brain activity would continue to improve as the drugs left her system. They were walking a careful line between allowing her to wake naturally and protecting her from the pain and confusion that would accompany her return to consciousness. Rodriguez continued his vigil, reading to Sarah from letters that had arrived from her family and fellow SEALs around the world. The story of her sacrifice and miraculous survival had inspired people throughout the military community, making her a symbol of courage and determination. As the 9th day approached, Dr. Mitchell prepared for what he hoped would be Sarah's emergence from her week-long journey between life and death. Her vital signs were now stable enough that consciousness was not only possible but expected within the next few days. The question that remained was whether the Sarah Martinez who awakened would be the same person who had fallen in that Afghan canyon, or if her impossible ordeal had changed her in ways that no one could yet understand. The moment everyone had been waiting for came at 14:32 hours on the 9th day. Rodriguez was reading aloud from a letter Sarah's mother had written when he noticed her eyelids fluttering. He stopped mid-sentence and leaned closer, his heart pounding, as Sarah's eyes slowly opened for the first time in over a week. Her initial gaze was unfocused and confused, moving around the ICU without seeming to recognize anything. Dr. Mitchell arrived within seconds, having been alerted by the monitoring equipment that detected Sarah's changing brainwave patterns. He began a gentle examination, checking her pupil responses and testing her basic neurological functions. Sarah's first attempt to speak produced only a weak whisper, her voice hoarse from days on the ventilator. Rodriguez squeezed her hand gently and spoke her name, watching as her eyes gradually focused on his face. Recognition flickered across her features, followed immediately by confusion about where she was and what had happened to her. Dr. Mitchell explained Sarah's situation carefully, telling her about the ambush, her injuries, and the miraculous, week-long recovery process that had brought her back from clinical death. Sarah listened with growing amazement and disbelief, her hand instinctively moving to touch the healing wounds on her chest and arms. The first few hours of Sarah's consciousness were difficult and disorienting. She experienced severe headaches and nausea as her brain adjusted to normal function after the extended period of minimal activity. Memory gaps made it hard for her to piece together the events of the ambush, and she struggled to understand how much time had passed. Rodriguez stayed by her side throughout the day, helping her work through the fragmented memories of the firefight. Sarah could remember the initial moments of the ambush and her decision to draw enemy fire away from her climbing teammates. But everything after the RPG explosion remained a complete blank until waking up in the hospital. Dr. Mitchell ran comprehensive neurological tests throughout Sarah's first day of consciousness, checking for any signs of brain damage or cognitive impairment. To his amazement and relief, Sarah's mental faculties appeared to be completely intact. Her memory, reasoning ability, and personality all seemed unchanged by her extraordinary ordeal. Physical therapy began immediately, as Sarah's muscles had weakened significantly during her week-long period of inactivity. Simple tasks like sitting up or holding a cup of water required tremendous effort, frustrating someone who had been in peak physical condition just days earlier. However, her strength began returning more quickly than anyone expected. The surviving members of Sarah's SEAL team visited her throughout the day, sharing their relief and amazement at her recovery. They told her how her sacrifice had allowed them to escape the ambush and complete their mission, eliminating the enemy fighters who had set the trap. Their gratitude was overwhelming, but Sarah struggled with survivors' guilt over the teammates who hadn't made it out alive. News of Sarah's awakening spread rapidly through military channels and eventually reached the media. Requests for interviews poured in from news organizations around the world, all wanting to speak with the female SEAL who had literally returned from the dead. Military public affairs officers worked to shield Sarah from the attention, while she focused on her recovery. Dr. Mitchell found himself inundated with requests from medical researchers who wanted to study Sarah's case. Her recovery challenged fundamental assumptions about brain death and opened new possibilities for trauma treatment. However, he insisted that Sarah's privacy and well-being take priority over scientific curiosity. As Sarah's second day of consciousness progressed, she began asking detailed questions about what had happened to her body during the week she was clinically dead. Dr. Mitchell explained the mysterious healing process he had observed, admitting that medical science had no explanation for her recovery. Sarah listened to his account with fascination and growing concern. The idea that she had been dead for a week then somehow returned to life troubled her deeply. She wondered if the experience had changed her in ways that weren't immediately apparent, and whether she would ever fully understand what had happened to her. Physical therapy sessions revealed that Sarah's body was healing at an accelerated rate. Wounds that should have taken weeks to close were already showing significant improvement. Her muscle strength was returning faster than normal, and her cardiovascular fitness seemed largely unaffected by her prolonged period of inactivity. Rodriguez shared letters and messages that had arrived from around the world during Sarah's unconscious period. Her story had inspired people far beyond the military community, becoming a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the power of the human spirit to overcome impossible odds. The outpouring of support overwhelmed Sarah, who had never sought fame or recognition. As her third day of consciousness began, Sarah started experiencing strange dreams and sensations that she couldn't fully explain. During her week of clinical death, she retained no conscious memories of the experience, yet she felt as though something profound had happened that was just beyond her ability to recall. Dr. Mitchell noted subtle changes in Sarah's brain scans that he couldn't interpret. Certain regions showed activity patterns that were different from her baseline tests, suggesting that her near-death experience might have altered her neurological function in ways that science didn't yet understand. Sarah began working with military psychologists to process the trauma of the ambush and her extraordinary recovery. The mental health professionals were fascinated by her case, as no one had ever worked with a patient who had experienced clinical death and returned to tell about it. Her psychological adjustment became as important as her physical healing. The question of Sarah's military future became a pressing concern. While her physical recovery was remarkable, military regulations regarding personnel who had been declared dead were unclear. Pentagon officials were reviewing her case to determine whether she could return to active duty or if her unprecedented situation required new policies. Sarah herself was torn about her future. Part of her wanted to return to her SEAL team and continue serving, while another part wondered if her extraordinary experience had changed her in ways that made combat operations too risky. The memory gaps from her week of clinical death left her questioning whether she was still the same person who had led that fateful mission. Rodriguez advocated strongly for Sarah's return to active duty, arguing that her leadership and experience were too valuable to lose. He pointed out that her sacrifice had saved the lives of her teammates and that her recovery proved she was tougher than anyone had imagined. The other surviving team members echoed his sentiments, wanting their proven leader back. Dr. Mitchell remained cautious about clearing Sarah for combat duty. While her physical recovery was remarkable, he worried about the long-term effects of her brain trauma and the week-long period without normal neurological function. He recommended extensive testing and observation before making any decisions about her military status. As Sarah's strength continued to improve, she began pushing herself harder in physical therapy sessions. Her determination to prove that she was ready to return to duty drove her to exceed every recovery milestone ahead of schedule. The medical staff was amazed by her progress, but they also worried that she was pushing too hard too fast. Late one evening, as Sarah was alone in her room reviewing mission reports, she experienced the first clear memory fragment from her week of clinical death. It was brief and confusing, a sense of floating above the canyon where she had fallen, watching the battle continue below. The memory felt real, but she knew it was medically impossible. She decided not to tell anyone about the strange recollection, fearing it might affect the medical team's assessment of her mental state. Instead, she focused on the physical aspects of her recovery, working tirelessly to regain the peak fitness that had made her an elite SEAL operator. The media attention surrounding Sarah's case continued to grow, despite military efforts to control the story. She became known as the Miracle SEAL in news reports, and her image appeared on magazine covers around the world. The attention made her uncomfortable, as she preferred to focus on her recovery and potential return to duty. Sarah's family arrived from Texas to visit her, bringing emotional reunions and tears of joy at seeing their daughter alive after being told she had died in combat. Their presence provided comfort and motivation for her continued recovery, reminding her of all the reasons she had to keep fighting. As the second week of her consciousness drew to a close, Sarah felt stronger and more confident about her future. The physical wounds were healing well, her mental faculties remained sharp, and her determination to return to service had only grown stronger. She began making plans for the intensive evaluation process that would determine whether she could rejoin her SEAL team and continue the mission that had nearly cost her life. 6 months after her miraculous recovery, Sarah Martinez stood on the deck of a Navy destroyer in the Persian Gulf, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and orange. She wore the uniform of a lieutenant commander, having been promoted in recognition of her extraordinary service and sacrifice. The Pentagon had ultimately decided that her unique experience made her more valuable, not less, to the military. The evaluation process had been lengthy and thorough, involving teams of doctors, psychologists, and military experts who studied every aspect of her condition and recovery. After months of testing, they concluded that Sarah was not only fit for duty, but had somehow emerged from her ordeal stronger and more capable than before. Her return to active service had been gradual and carefully monitored. She started with training exercises and gradually worked up to operational missions. Her teammates, led by Rodriguez, who had been promoted to staff sergeant, welcomed her back with enthusiasm and relief. The bond forged by their shared trauma in that Afghan canyon had made their unit even more effective. Sarah discovered that her near-death experience had given her heightened situational awareness and decision-making, abilities that her superiors found remarkable. She seemed to anticipate threats and opportunities with an almost supernatural accuracy, leading to a string of successful missions that enhanced her reputation throughout the special operations community. The strange memory fragments from her week of clinical death continued to surface occasionally, but Sarah had learned to view them as a source of strength rather than confusion. Whether they were real experiences or products of her traumatized brain didn't matter as much as the insights they provided about leadership, sacrifice, and the bonds between soldiers. Dr. Mitchell published several research papers about Sarah's case, revolutionizing medical understanding of brain death and recovery. His work opened new avenues for treating severe trauma patients and gave hope to families facing similar situations. Sarah had become a living symbol of the resilience of the human spirit and the mysteries that science had yet to solve. The media attention eventually faded, allowing Sarah to focus on her military career without constant scrutiny. She used her platform to advocate for improved medical care for wounded veterans and to inspire young women considering military service. Her story became required reading at military academies and leadership schools around the world. Rodriguez remained her closest friend and most trusted advisor, their partnership strengthened by the crucible of combat and the miracle of her recovery. Together, they led missions throughout the Middle East and Africa, earning commendations for their unit's exceptional performance and zero casualty rate under Sarah's command. Sarah's family had initially wanted her to leave the military after her ordeal, fearing for her safety and questioning why she would risk her life again after such a traumatic experience. But they came to understand that serving others was fundamental to who Sarah was, and that her near-death experience had only strengthened her commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The nightmares that had plagued Sarah in the early weeks after her recovery gradually faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and clarity about her role in the world. She felt as though she had been given a second chance for a reason, and she was determined to make the most of the opportunity. As she stood on the destroyer's deck that morning, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The ambush in Afghanistan seemed like a lifetime ago, yet the lessons learned in that canyon continued to shape her leadership style and her approach to life. She thought about the teammates who hadn't made it home from that mission, honoring their memory by living each day with purpose and determination. Their sacrifice had not been in vain, and neither had her own brush with death. Every successful mission, every life saved, every young soldier inspired by her story was a testament to their shared commitment to service. Rodriguez joined her at the ship's rail, and they stood in comfortable silence watching the sun climb higher into the clear morning sky. Both knew that new challenges awaited them, new missions that would test their skills and courage. But they also knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, strengthened by the bonds forged in combat and the miracle that had brought their leader back from the grave. Sarah Martinez had learned that SEALs never stay down, No matter how impossible the odds or how final defeat might seem, she had literally emerged from death itself, proving that the human spirit could overcome anything when fueled by courage, determination, and the support of those who refused to give up hope. Her story would inspire generations of warriors who followed in her footsteps, carrying the message that no mission is truly impossible and no cause truly lost. The destroyer began moving toward its next operational area as Sarah and Rodriguez headed below deck to brief their team on the upcoming mission. There was work to do, lives to save, and enemies to face. For Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, the woman who had returned from the dead, it was just another day in the life of a Navy SEAL who had learned that the greatest victories often come after the darkest defeats.